Hello again everybody, and today we come to the third in my series of talks about buildings, specifically buildings in Athens, and within Athens the buildings on the Acropolis, the sacred rocky outcrop right in the middle of the city. I've talked about the Parthenon, the big, grand, very famous building. I've talked about Athene Nike, my favourite, small, delicate, perfectly formed. And today we come to the Erechtheion, which in many ways is the most complicated of the three. The architect, when asked to build this, was faced with a series of problems, and that's kind of driving my talk today. So what do you do when you're faced with one problem, two problems, three problems, perhaps more, all of which combined seem to make an almost impossible solution to find? So you've got to have a building that looks elegant and beautiful. You've got to incorporate shrines to Athene and Poseidon and Erechtheus and Cecrops, legendary kings of Athens. The whole site is quite significantly sloping, and you've got to make it all work together somehow. First of all, to think about why you need several shrines in the same place. One of the things about this area was it was the place where the Athenians believed that Athene and Poseidon had competed to be patron deity of the city, and so they were each asked by the Athenians to provide a gift to see which would be the most useful. So Poseidon struck the rock of the Acropolis with his trident, and out came a spring of water. And Athene decided that she would offer the gift of an olive tree. Well, the Athenians thought long and hard, and eventually they thought the olive tree would be better, and so the Athenian economy kind of became based on the olive. So it's got to incorporate those two ideas. It's got to incorporate the tombs of Erechtheus and Cecrops, two of the legendary founders of Athens, and like I said, it's on a very sloping site. Well, it was part of the Periclean building program, according to Plutarch, and archaeology confirms this. We actually have the building accounts for quite large parts of the building of the Erechtheum, which shows what sort of craftsmen there were, what proportion there were of free people, and whether they were free or whether they were slaves, how much they were paid, what sort of skills they particularly had. The Temple of Athene had to replace, really, the former Temple of Athene, which had been destroyed by the Persians. Now, while the Parthenon was sort of a replacement for that, that was more a big political statement. The Erechtheion and the sanctuary of Athene within that was more a religiously important site, and it had to house the statue, the ancient olive wood statue of Athene Polias. This was very important because the Panathenaic procession, which went through the city, had to present the peplos. This is all portrayed on the frieze of the Parthenon, of course, but the actual dress went on the statue of Athene Polias, which was in the temple of the Erechtheion. So you've got to process up through the propylae around the far end to the east end of the Acropolis, and then into the temple to present the peplos. So it's got to do that. There's also the porch, where there's a well where Poseidon struck the Acropolis. And you've got to have a hole in the roof, because that's got to be where Poseidon would poke down with his trident. So the porch needed to have a hole in the floor, and it needed to have a hole in the roof. It also it's the lowest point on the site, on the north edge of the Acropolis, and so that porch that houses that shrine has to have very long columns indeed, and they've got to look in proportion to that side of the building. That porch is lower than the rest of the temple, and it contrasts considerably in height with the porch on the other side, which I shall come to in a little while. It's hard to know what the old west end of the temple actually looked like, because the Romans altered it quite a bit, we think. So it's hard to judge on that. But we do know that underneath there was an entrance to where probably were the tombs of Erechtheus and Cecrops. Next to that was the little walled garden, which was where the sacred olive tree of Athene was. So that's got to look okay, and the temple can't go too far because you can't build over where the olive tree was growing. So we go round to the east end. Now the east end has 6 elegant Ionic columns across the front as the entrance to the shrine of Athene Polias. And when you just look at that end of the site, it looks like a regular temple. So it succeeds in allowing the form and the function to come together quite well. The south porch is the one that's nearest the Parthenon, is the most famous bit of the whole temple. This is the so-called Caryatid porch. Instead of being held up with columns, it's actually held up by columns in the shape of women, elegantly portrayed with the classical style of the day, of the 420s, the 410s, perhaps into the 490s BC. Now these stood there until 1977, and then they had to be removed and replaced with replicas because they were being damaged by the awful environmental fumes of Athens. This is all except for one of the Caryatids, which was one of the statues which was bought or looted by Lord Elgin at the very beginning of the 19th century, and so that actually is in London. It's also a problem for that porch because it's on substantially higher ground than the north porch, which is where the shrine of Poseidon was. So it's got to look elegant, and that's one of the reasons for there being Caryatids rather than more conventional columns. That porch is also interesting architecturally because it was imitated by design by the architects of St Pancras Church in London, just on Euston Road, more or less opposite St Pancras Station. This large and rather austere building, neoclassical building, has a Caryatid porch on either side of it. These serve no function really whatever. They're just there to look nice. So it's ironic that the Caryatid porch was there to look nice and to have a function in Athens, where it's there just to look nice in London. But if you're ever in London, it's well worth going to that church and thinking about that and looking at the whole building, whether you think it works in its own context. So at the beginning of this, I asked the question of how you would solve all those problems altogether. Well, you do it partly with elegant solutions, having tall Ionic columns. You design the building so it incorporates access to tombs with having a sort of undercroft or crypt almost. You truncate it so you don't build over the sacred olive tree. You have a nice elegant end which kind of disguises the fact that the building is quite odd. And that's where you have the elegant entrance to the shrine of Athene Polias. And then you have the elegant Caryatid porch on the south side, where you replace columns with elegant women. So in lots of ways, although the Erechtheum is kind of odd in its design, it has that combination of the ideal combination of function and of ingenuity, skill and elegance. So it's the ideal combination of function, religious respect and beauty. Perhaps some modern architects should bear that in mind when they're designing buildings now.